Next speaker is Associate Professor Ahmad Shaboul. Ahmad Shaboul was born in Sharjah, Jordan, and obtained a licensee letters from the University of Damascus, Syria, and a PhD from the Royal Holloway College, University of London. He is currently the chair of the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. Former chair of the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. Thank you very much, Professor. The School of Language and Cultures at the University of Sydney. Assistant Professor Ahmad Shaboul research interests include intellectual history and historiography of the Arabic Islamic world, Arabic Greek, especially Byzantine cultural relations and mutual perceptions, cities, human geography and cultural dynamics in Arab and Islamic history, Islam, society and politics in the contemporary Middle East, and aesthetics of place in creative Arabic literature, poetry and novel. Associate Professor Ahmad Shaboul's topic for today is the inter-Arab crisis and its impact on the Palestine cause. Can I ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Shaboul?
Thank you, Shaoquett. Sorry, I'm a bit shaky with my feet, not because I'm fasting, I'm not fasting, but I'm actually on antibiotics, so excuse my not so powerful voice. I try my best. First of all, I would like to join my friends and colleagues and the convener in acknowledging that we are standing on the land of the indigenous people of this country, and we recognize their custody of this land and hope for a better future of cooperation between all Australians, including the indigenous population. Perhaps I should start by saying that I deliberately chosen to talk of the Palestine cause, although Shaoquett has asked me to talk about the Palestinian state. I believe that the question about Palestinian state has been bogged down by machinations and has been obscured by clouds of semantics, whereas I believe that the Palestine cause is both a political and a human rights cause, and of course also is a moral cause, as my previous colleagues have outlined. No matter what may be said about a state, two state, one state, no state, the Palestine cause is alive and should be kept alive, for it is a cause of freedom and justice against colonization and occupation. Now, if I were to define the impact of inter-Arab crisis on the Palestine cause in one word, I would just use the word horrible. But as a student of history and sociology, I'm going to take a leaf from Antonio Gramsci's prison notebooks. Namely, I'm going to adopt with my own adaptation Gramsci's notion that the starting point of critical elaboration of what our situation now is, that it is a product of the historical process to date. And that, I continue the quotation, therefore it is imperative to compile some kind of inventory of what has happened so far. Now I must add that the last phrase actually does not exist in the English translation of Gramsci's Quadrini di Seri, and I've got that last quotation thanks to the late Edward Said, who, as you know, has contributed so much to our understanding of the Palestine cause. Now, of course, I'm not going to give you a detailed inventory of what happened since 1917, the Balfour Declaration, or not even since 48. So I have chosen to focus on 4 points, actually. The first is what I would call the gradual decline and near collapse of the Arab regional system. Remember here, my task is not actually as pleasant, because it's quite painful. But I try to look at it as what Edward Said called an exercise in critical consciousness. So as an Arab Australian, I am being self-critical, if you like, of the Arab world, including, I suppose, myself. The second point is the failure, or at least the ineffectiveness of the foreign policies of the Arab states so far. And the third is the problem of the asymmetry, or if you like, lack of balance. I think this has been touched upon by my colleagues before, between the Palestinian and the Arab side on the one hand, and Israel and its supporters on the other, at all levels, in fact. We'll come to this point later. And the fourth point is the disturbing lack of support for the Palestinian cause in the USA in particular, and also in some of its Western allies countries, particularly at the official foreign policy level. Now, I'll focus more on the first point. Now, by the Arab regional system, I, of course, mean essentially the what happened to the League of Arab States, which was established actually as early as 1945, the same year as the United Nations organization. It's much older than any other actual regional system, including the European Union, and the future of the child. It was created before the oil boom, mind you. But the failure of the Arab League and of the Arab political elites to achieve an effective regional system or any practical framework for solidarity or cooperation, which the Arab peoples wanted and expected all the time, was not only caused by failure of leadership, only partly it was caused by failure of Arab leadership. Please allow me to remark that I'm here not only talking as a student of history who just read some archives. I happen to belong to that generation of Arabs whom the late President Nasser called the generation of destiny in the 50s. Actually, one of my philosophy teachers, Muta Safati, wrote a novel called Jid al-Qadar, the generation of destiny. So I'm not saying this just in philosophical terms. I'm saying it because I personally remember the demonstrations against, for example, the Baghdad Pact in the 1950s, Article 55. I have to walk in the rain for about 14 kilometers actually in winter to get to the next town. And I was, in those days I was a school kid, and I remember the Suez Crisis, of course, and the tripartite invasion of Egypt in '56. And in 1958 I recall what the then President Eisenhower of the United States called the vacuum which existed in the Middle East after the demise of British and French colonial influence there, and that the United States wanted to fill that vacuum. And I remember people were demonstrating saying the vacuum actually is in Eisenhower's head. Now, you can imagine my nightmares when I think of those days and the promise which we were dreaming about, and when I see what is happening now in the Arab world, not just in Iraq since '91 or 2003, but also since 2011 in Syria and Libya and the Yemen, and the threats also which actually now encircle other Arab countries, including my own place of birth in Jordan. Now, my purpose of recalling this is simply to highlight the fact that the weakness of the Arab regional system predates and partly explains the current failure of the so-called crisis in the Arab world. Certainly it predates the Arab Spring. So it explains the current Arab crisis and its impact on the Palestine cause. This weakness seems to me inherent. It's inherent in the Arab region's geostrategic position in international relations, as designed by external powers. This weakness has not been only due to antiquated Arab regimes, which, by the way, until the mid-50s were themselves created by the outside great powers. The Arab region has been not only crisscrossed by Western especially American interests since the 50s, as Edward Said has reminded us as early as 1978 in his Orientalism book. Nor is the Middle East only the most penetrated region in international affairs, at least since World War I, but it has been more and more actually dominated and controlled by non-Arab external powers, including especially the USA and its favored local ally, Israel. This is especially so since the 1970s, which I suppose is the period of what has been called by Edward Said again, the passing away of the first post-colonial leaders, and indeed the anti-colonial, the passing away of the first anti-colonial colonial generation. The most important whom, of course, was the towering figure of Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was vehement in his anti-colonial stance and his opposition to any attempt at making the Arab world a sphere of influence for neo-colonialism. That was a favorite of his. We don't want the Arab world to be a sphere of influence, because I remember many of his speeches. Nasser, by the way, was not anti-Western, as he often is described in the media, or was at the time of the Suez Crisis. He was definitely anti-colonial. Just in the same way as Palestinians and Arabs in general are not anti-Jewish, but anti-Zionist. Now, if the Arab League was midwifed by Great Britain, at least between 1945 and sustained in 1954, the Gulf Cooperation Council has been midwifed and supported by the USA since 1980 and to the present. One factor in the demise of the Arab regional system, as exemplified by the Arab League, and of the demise of Nasser's project of Arab unity, or at least Arab coordination, was itself born from Nasser's own failures as a leader, particularly the 1967 debacle and, of course, the idea of the military and mukhabarat state, as well as from the failure of such nationalist parties as the Ba'ath Party. The key problem here is the role of the military, or the rule of military, in such countries, Arab countries as Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and the Yemen. Now here we can see a combination of three factors explaining the continuing weakness of the Arab states. First, since 1948, is Israel's ascendance as a regional power, particularly, I suppose, after '67. The US political leaders started immediately, some of you might recall, talking about a new Middle East after 1967. Because this term, which by the way was vaguely born as early as 1911, the term Middle East, suddenly its stocks started to skyrocket overnight after 1967 war. So that's the first factor, the emergence of Israel as a superpower in the region. Secondly, the turning towards more conservative policies, even by such Arab regimes which call themselves revolutionary and socialist. I'm talking about Syria, Iraq, and Libya, for example. And also, again, a move towards more focus on the nation state at the expense of pan-Arab interests, including the Palestinian cause. Not only by the oil-rich regimes, but also by the so-called pan-Arab regimes, with slogans included in those days: unity, liberty, and socialism. This turn actually is exemplified also by not only obsession with oil in terms of those countries of the Arabian Peninsula, but also the obsession, as we have in this country, of national security, which, by the way, in Arabic, national has two words. One means pan-Arab, Omi, and one means Watani, which means the nation-state nationalism. So this obsession with the limited national state at the expense of pan-Arabism and also of national security. The third issue here within that weakness process is that the late 1970s, as most of you would recall, has witnessed the emergence of the Islamic factor as a significant player in Arab politics, societies and also in Arab political culture generally. It is sort of started to gain momentum. One could talk for a long time about this. This has continued to grow and expand, and it culminated into the near success of fundamentalist Muslim parties in Algeria. You remember the election in the 90s? The temporary success of a member of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt to become president of Egypt, at least for 1 year, and the half success of Rashid al-Nushi's Nahda party in Tunisia after the debacle of the former regime due to the first country which witnessed the Arab Spring, Tunisia. Of course, a parallel manifestation of this rise of the Islamic factor is exemplified in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Republic since 1979. Now, above all, this same process at another plane of conceptualization and action, if you like, begat, it's another birth metaphor, the phenomenon of the entrenchment of the politics of militancy in the name of Islam. Beginning with Bin Laden's Al-Qaeda, which, by the way, was born just after 1979, after the Soviet interference in Afghanistan. And of course, Taliban followed. And then, of course, from Al-Qaeda, we have Daesh or ISIS, which is now, of course, the worst monster of them all. But the strange thing is the Daesh and others raise the flag with the same phrase, which is actually the Muslim expression of faith, which is also the same statement on the Saudi flag. It's been since the 1930s. Now, of course, no one can deny that the United States, through the CIA, has been responsible for the creation of Al-Qaeda with Saudi financial support. And therefore, by implication, there is some responsibility for the emergence of ISIS or Daesh. Now, nowadays, many in the Arab world and also beyond are talking about the carving up of certain Arab countries. So, I mean, how far the Arab world has traveled from the days of my school years. Particularly, we are thinking of, people are thinking about Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen. And in some sense, the process seems to have, unfortunately, already got to the point of no return. Now, this situation may explain the almost complete failure of the so-called Arab Spring since 2011. Tunisia is, of course, a possible exception. Now, in this situation, there is no doubt that the Palestine cause has been not only put on the Arab back burner. I think even any positive Arab discourse about the Palestine cause has become utterly submerged among the din and fury of internal problems and irrational politics of those few regimes which had claimed in the past some interest in supporting the Palestinian cause, particularly Iraq and Syria, and to a certain extent Egypt. The truth is, with few exceptions, official policies of most Arab regimes have been inadequate and not serious enough on balance. And I'm putting it very politely. There are signs of this since 1936. I don't know how much time I still have. Okay. In 1936, the famous Palestine Revolution against both British colonialism and the Zionist project, which in my thinking is actually the first Palestinian Intifada, when it was nearing its success and the British felt the heat, they persuaded their friendly Arab states to call on their brethren, the leaders of the revolution, to put down their arms, because our good friend Great Britain assured us that he is going to give you your rights. This is the first example, and this happens again during what we know as the First Intifada of 1987. Now, the fact of the ineffectiveness of official Arab foreign policy, which is my second general point very quickly, regarding Palestine, is actually a terrible system of the malaise which I have just described. Edward Said and others have discussed the difficulty of having the Arab voice, including the Palestinian voice in particular, heard, particularly in the United States. Part of the problem is actually connected to the political profile of the Arab world as it appears in international relations as perceived particularly by the United States policymakers. So, I mean, there's of course the prejudice, there's the strength of the Jewish lobby, but there's also the poor profile of Arab politics and the Arab world as a region in this system. And also in the Western media. And part of the negativity of this profile has to do with the inadequacy of Arab political muscle, if you like. Despite, I'm not talking about military, I'm talking about political muscle. Despite all the oil wealth which a number of Arab states possess, and the funds from which is mostly used in the United States and with other Western banks and companies. If I have time later, I will tell you an anecdote about how official America views the weakness of Arab diplomacy. Now, of course, in new indirect alliances between, for example, Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf states and Israel, at least unofficially, are a lot in the current discourse, and this is meant as to be directed against the new danger which is being made up, namely Iran. It's really the Israeli discourse being swallowed whole by some of the naive Arab policy makers, not policy makers really, policy followers I should say. Now the other point, the third point I want to touch on very briefly is the imbalance. I think Peter Slezak has already indicated that very clearly. The asymmetry, the imbalance between both sides, the Israeli on one side, the Palestinian and the Arab on the other. Of course, we know about the imbalance in military power. Even in '48, there were more and stronger, shall we say, Jewish forces fighting in Palestine than the totality of all the Arab armies which were involved. This is often not realized. But I'm more concerned about the political, diplomatic level. This asymmetry, I think, needs to be remembered. Of course, the asymmetry started, again, I have to go back to the Balfour Declaration. It's not 1917. And Edward Said and others have discussed the text. I mean, you remember that the key words, that he was more concerned about the political rights of the Jews, not only in Palestine, but in the rest of the world. But he only could talk about the religious right of the non-Jewish population. So, 94% of the population of Palestine at that time were considered negatively as the non-Jewish element of the population. And you can go on adding actually to what Peter Slezak was talking about. Now, finally, the question of the lack of sympathy, I think, is very well known. But I think the inter-Arab crisis and the rise of militant Islamic entities, especially ISIS, has made the image of the Arab world and therefore of Palestine not very attractive. And therefore it has impacted very badly and negatively on the cause. In conclusion, I would say that the Palestinian issue, for all intents and purposes, seems to have slipped out of the hands of Arabic political leaders, at least for some time now, although I would say it has been slipping out of their hands, if some of them in fact never had it in their hands. Now, the inter-Arab crisis, the failures of the Arab regional system, the inter-Arab wars, particularly in countries like Syria and the Yemen, as we know today from the news, and the combined sectarian tribal discourse, is a very important factor. What we have now, a combination of sectarian and tribal racist discourse going on in the Arab world, particularly against Iran. It's, I mean, if you follow the Arabic media and Facebook and so on, it's really very distressing. Now, this, in fact, has increasingly bedeviled the decision-making of some Arab regimes, and the obsession also with enmity, as I said, towards Iran. All of this pours into Israel's political, shall we say, political coffers, into its credit balance sheet, if you like, despite all the atrocities which Israel continues to commit against the Palestinians. With seeing all this, people, you know, will say, well, look what is happening in Syria, what's happening in other countries. All this, of course, is done in violations of international law and human rights. Now, this leaves us with this conclusion. Just as internationally we need to focus more on activism at the civil society level, particularly within the context of BDS, we need also to focus on the Arab world from the same perspective of civil society, and to advocate for BDS in those countries that have officially or clandestinely been dealing with Israel as an occupying power. Now I finish with a quotation from great scholar and creative writer Raymond Williams. Again, this is via Edward Said, who talked about the need to unlearn the inherent dominative mode. In other words, great powers, Arab states, the official discourse, the official media, whether it's News Corp and others, are those inherent dominative mode which we have to unlearn. I would add also which we have to combat if we were to keep supporting the Palestine cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that historical analysis and complex area of Middle East politics. Ladies and gentlemen, we do have 10 minutes of questions. Who would like to ask the first question? I want to give an opportunity to people who have not asked questions. Lady here first.
Professor Shaboul, thank you for your talk. In the light of that, what is your view of the so-called Arab initiative in relation to the inter-Arab crisis and the impact on the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
I think as Avi Schleim has demonstrated very extensively in his book, The Iron Wall, and I think Peter Stezek referred to this, I need to ask you which one of the many Arab initiatives.
I'm talking about the particular paper that's on the table now.
Can you give me a hint? I haven't been reading the news for the last 2 weeks.
Well, I'm understanding there's one that was issued 10 years ago and then reissued.
Are you talking about the one which is sometimes dubbed by the Saudis as the King Fahd proposal?
Yeah, maybe.
Which basically was talking about the willingness of Arab states collectively to acknowledge, that's to say, recognize Israel as a state in the region, as opposed to just its right to exist, which is not legal, in return for withdrawal to the 1967 borders and acknowledging the rights of the Palestinians and so on. So the question is, you know, you want my view from which perspective? From the Arab perspective? Well, Israel, of course, does not respond to this seriously. And the US has been very wishy-washy, as usual, about it for a long time, despite its close friendship with the Saudis. And the Saudis, unfortunately, I mean, I have great admiration for the Saudis as a people, the Saudi people and their culture. But unfortunately, the regime at the moment, and also some of its princes who are not necessarily political active, who are not active in the political scene, are more concerned not only of their national security and or wealth and so on, but also in investment in the West. I'm thinking of Prince Al-Walid, for example. And they are more interested in getting rid of those Arab regimes with whom they had a grudge, such as Syria, and also they are using their wealth to influence others. As we know, they are interested in Jordan and Egypt and so on. So if you want me to go on about being self-critical, I can't go on. But that initiative is, in fact, as dead as the Oslo Accords. Maybe you should ask Tony Blair,
Next question. The lady there. Yes. I don't want to use colours, so it's brown.
Thank you, Professor Shaboul. I just want to follow on from this, because it was the Arab League that proposed a long time ago a framework for a peace settlement with Israel, and it would recognize the Israel state on 1967 borders. However, I want to ask you, does the Arab League now have any importance?
Did you say import or importance?
Importance. Does the Arab League matter now?
I think I'm going to take a leaf from Stuart Rees's book and scratch my head. Sorry, I mean, I'm telling you really by scratching my head that I'm looking for a way of saying, do they really have any importance? No, they don't. You see, I mean, I didn't put it very clearly, I suppose very bluntly, but basically I was trying in my own poetic way to put it somewhat aesthetically, that they sort of have faded away. I mean, the Arab League is you see, I could talk for a long time about this, because the Arab League, as I said earlier, is older than the European Common Market, which has now become the European Union. And it could have become, but if you look at the history of the Arab League, even its constitution and so on, it was meant just to keep the status quo. I think I used that phrase. There was no idea of involvement into something more meaningful. So it's dying of natural causes. Yeah.
Any further questions?
When you refer to the Arab League or to representative Arab groups, do you really mean a club for blokes, a bit like privileged clubs on the south bank of the Thames in London?
No, you see,
In other words, it's got nothing to do with women.
no, at Arab League meetings they don't drink wine except secretly. So, and women are historically, I suppose, have been excluded. I mean, come on, Stuart, women have been excluded in many other countries, including this one, for a long time. But you're right. I mean, it's really look. I wish I were a cartoonist. I mean, the idea is these guys meet, they embrace each other, and then they achieve nothing and go home and start, backbiting and so on. Okay, it's worse than a gentleman's club. Mind you, I don't have much experience in gentlemen's club, so I'm not quite sure whether the ones you know are as bad.
One more question, and I failed to acknowledge the Deputy Consul General of Egypt, and he would like to ask a question. Trish, if you wouldn't mind. Mr. Ahmed would like to ask a question.
Shaoquett, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be here with this wonderful academics, people who enriches us with their point of view on the Palestinian cause and Palestinian state. Well, Professor Shaboul, I was really attempted and tempted not to speak, but I don't want to be the devil's advocate here.
Go ahead, no, it's all right.
And try, but I recognize that the Arab states have failed in many ways to put the Palestinian cause in its right position within their political framework. But let me put this rhetoric question to you. If the situation was a little bit different, wouldn't you think that the Palestinian population and the Palestinian cause would be a historical metaphor as the American Indians or the Latin Americans, indigenous people. I mean, I think something was right and something has been done that we still, after 60 years, we're still talking about the rights of the Palestinians. I mean, we're not all guilty, but we're not all, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a rhetorical question.
Okay.
If you can address it, please.
I will be very brief because of the question of time, of course. Look, I did say at the outset that I'm actually engaging in an exercise of critical consciousness. I'm being critical of the Arab world. I think if I were talking to a totally Arab audience in Arabic, I would be much more critical.